The email arrived at 2:24 a.m., the blue light from my phone cutting through the darkness of what used to be our bedroom. My fingers trembled as I read the message from Natalie Palmer, my husband's co-worker of just 10 months. Rebecca, I thought, you should know that Mark and I are finalizing the paperwork on the Ridgewood estate this week. He told me how you never really appreciated its historical value anyway. He says your grandmother would have wanted the property to be loved by someone who understands its significance. Don't worry, we're keeping all the original fixtures. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My body went cold as I stared at the message. The Ridgewood estate. My grandmother's beloved historic mansion, the crown jewel of the inheritance she'd left me 3 years ago, the property that had been in my family for generations. The home Mark and I had planned to restore together once we had saved enough for the renovations, or so I had thought. I scrolled down, reading the rest of Natalie's message with growing disbelief. Mark mentioned you've been too consumed with your little real estate job to focus on preserving true heritage properties. Don't worry about the other properties in the portfolio. We'll make good use of the rental income. Consider the downtown condo your consolation prize. You always said it was convenient for your work. The downtown condo? A consolation prize? My grandmother had left me 5 properties, including the Ridgewood estate, along with a substantial investment portfolio. Properties that I had carefully managed, paying taxes on them with my own income from my real estate career, while Mark insisted we wait for the right time to begin renovations on the estate. I stepped out of bed, my bare feet numb against the hardwood floor. Walking to the window, I looked out at the Denver skyline, the mountains a dark shadow beyond the city lights. Somewhere out there, Mark and Natalie were planning their future in my family's historic mansion, laughing about how easily they'd pushed me aside. My phone buzzed again, another message from Natalie. Mark says you can keep your grandmother's jewelry. He thinks I'd look too young in those vintage pieces anyway. Rage replaced shock, flowing through me like wildfire. The jewelry was the least of it. My grandmother had been one of the first female property developers in Denver. She'd built her portfolio during a time when women were supposed to be homemakers, not businesswomen. She'd taught me everything I knew about real estate, property law, and investment strategy. It was her voice I heard in my head now. Always read the fine print, Rebecca. Always have a backup plan. And I had. Mark had never understood why I'd spent weekends studying property law after graduating with my real estate license. He'd mocked my careful documentation of every transaction, every deed transfer, every trust amendment. That's what we pay lawyers for, he'd say, rolling his eyes at my obsessive attention to detail. What he didn't know, what I had never told him, was that I'd learned from watching my mother lose everything in her divorce. I'd vowed not to make the same mistake. My hands stopped shaking as determination replaced fear. The Ridgewood estate wasn't just a property. It was my legacy, my birthright, and I had spent too many years being underestimated by my husband to let him and his girlfriend steal it from me now. I opened my laptop and navigated to my personal secure cloud storage. There, organized in meticulous folders, was every document related to my inheritance, including the original deeds with my name as sole owner, the trust documents establishing the properties as separate from our marital assets, and the carefully structured LLC that held ownership of the entire portfolio. A smile crept across my face. Mark had always been careless with legal details. He'd signed paperwork without reading it, trusting me to handle the boring stuff, while he charmed clients and took credit for the investment strategies I'd developed. I picked up my phone and dialed a number I knew by heart. It rang 4 times before a groggy voice answered. Grace? It's Rebecca. I'm sorry for calling at this hour, but I need your legal expertise. Remember those trust amendments we filed last year? The ones securing my inheritance as separate property? I think it's time to activate our contingency plan. Grace Chen, my best friend since college and one of Denver's most respected property attorneys, was silent for a moment. Then she spoke, her voice gaining clarity as she processed my words. The Ridgewood estate? Becca, are you sure about this? More sure than I've ever been, I replied, watching the first hint of dawn touch, the mountains. Mark and Natalie are trying to steal my inheritance. I need to show them who really owns these properties. As I ended the call, one final message from Natalie lit up my screen. Don't worry, we'll invite you to the housewarming. Mark says, it's the least we can do after you've been so accommodating. I didn't respond. Instead, I walked to my closet and slid aside the row of business suits, revealing a hidden wall safe. Inside was a locked document case containing paperwork Mark had never seen, paperwork that would stop him and Natalie in their tracks. By sunrise, I would set in motion a plan that would remind them both that some inheritances come with strings attached. Some legacies can't be stolen, and some women can't be underestimated. The first rays of morning light were just breaking over the mountains as I sat at my desk, surrounded by 3 years' worth of meticulously organized documents. My hands moved efficiently, sorting papers into strategic piles as I built my case. The coffee I'd made at 3 a.m. sat cold and untouched. Food was the last thing on my mind. The shock of Natalie's messages had crystallized into cold determination, a clarity of purpose that would fuel the difficult days ahead. The printer hummed as I made copies of key documents. The original deed to the Ridgewood estate with my name as sole owner. The trust documents establishing my inheritance as separate property. The amendments filed with the county recorder's office. The LLC operating agreement listing me as the only member with authority to transfer properties. Mark had always laughed at my paranoid record-keeping. Becca, sweetheart, he'd say with that condescending smile. That's what we pay accountants for. You don't need to keep all this paperwork. But I'd watched my mother lose everything when my father divorced her. How quickly he'd erased her contributions to their shared business. How thoroughly he'd convinced the court that she was just a housewife, who deserved only the minimum settlement. I'd vowed never to be in that position. My attention turned to a document I'd pulled from my safe, the original proposal for the Ridgewood estate's restoration, drafted 2 years ago when we first discussed renovating the property. Mark had declined to move forward, claiming we needed to wait for property values to increase in that area. Now I understood why. He'd been planning to renovate it with her. My laptop chimed with an email notification from Grace. Rebecca, I've reviewed everything. The documents are airtight. Meet me at my office at 9 a.m. Bring all the Ridgewood paperwork and anything related to your grandmother's trust. Don't contact Mark yet. A glimmer of hope sparked within me. Grace had been my secret weapon when I'd drafted the inheritance protection documents. She'd helped me create ironclad legal structures that Mark, with his dismissive attitude toward paperwork, had never bothered to understand. Just standard legal language, Grace would tell him whenever he questioned a clause, knowing he'd never actually read the details. My phone lit up with Mark's name. My heart pounded, but my hands remained steady as I declined the call. Let him wonder. Let him sweat. Instead of answering, I walked to our home office and opened a concealed panel behind Mark's collection of financial awards. Inside was another safe he didn't know about, containing the original deeds to the first 2 investment properties we'd purchased together. Properties that had been my idea, bought with funds from my early inheritance before. My grandmother passed away. Mark had been reluctant, calling them risky investments in undesirable areas. But I'd insisted, and those properties had tripled in value, forming the foundation of what Mark now called his real estate portfolio. The safe also held USB drives containing recordings of every major financial discussion we'd had in the last 4 years. Mark had recorded them for future reference, never realizing I kept my own copies. Copies that clearly showed who had really made the investment. Decisions, structured the deals, and built the relationships with property developers that had made us successful. I glanced at the clock, 7:15 a.m. Time to prepare for my meeting with Grace. As I showered, I allowed myself to feel the full magnitude of Mark's betrayal. The pain cut deep, not just because he'd found someone else, but because he'd tried to take the one thing that connected me to my grandmother, the woman who had believed in me when no one else did. The Ridgewood estate wasn't just a property. It represented every Sunday afternoon I'd spent with my grandmother as she taught me about load-bearing walls and historical preservation. Every summer I'd helped her manage her properties. Every moment. She'd encouraged me to be independent in a world that expected women to be dependent. But as I dressed in my most professional outfit, preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. A charcoal pencil skirt and cream blouse beneath a structured blazer. I saw a different woman in the mirror. Not the trusting wife who had supported Mark's career at the expense of her own. Not the dutiful granddaughter still mourning her mentor. Instead, I saw someone stronger, someone who refused to be a victim, someone who had prepared for this moment without ever expecting it to arrive. I fastened my grandmother's vintage pearl necklace around my throat, the one piece of jewelry Mark had generously said I could keep. A text from my sister Emily lit up my phone. Saw Mark having breakfast with some woman at the Copper Kettle. They were looking at renovation plans. What's going on, Becca? The Copper Kettle, our favorite coffee shop. The place where Mark and I had sketched our first dreams of renovating the Ridgewood estate. Of course, he would take Natalie there, rewriting our history as he planned to rewrite my family's legacy. I sent a quick reply. Come over tonight. I'll explain everything. Emily would understand. She'd been the one who'd encouraged me to protect my inheritance legally, who'd seen through Mark's charming facade years before I had. He takes too much credit, she'd warned me once. One day, he'll try to take it all. As I gathered my documents for the meeting with Grace, my phone rang again. Mark. This time, I answered. Rebecca. His voice was casual, as if nothing had changed, as if he hadn't been planning to steal my family's legacy. We need to talk. Yes, I replied, my voice steady. We do. But not now. I have a meeting. A meeting? With whom? Concern tinged his voice. Mark had always underestimated my professional network, my relationships with the people who really made Denver's real estate market function. You'll find out soon enough. I ended the call before he could respond and stepped into the elevator of our building. Catching my reflection in the polished doors, I hardly recognized myself. I looked different, determined, powerful. The woman who had received that email at 2:24 a.m. was gone. In her place stood someone who refused to be written out of her own inheritance. The Ridgewood estate had always been my birthright. Now it would become my battleground. And Mark? Mark was about to learn that some legacies come with a price. Grace's law office occupied the top floor of a renovated historic building in Lodo, its tall windows offering a panoramic view of the city and mountains beyond. As I spread my documents across the conference table, I could actually see the distinctive slate roof of the Ridgewood estate in the distance, its Victorian turrets rising above the surrounding trees. Start from the beginning, Grace said, adjusting her glasses as she examined the papers before her. Tell me everything about the inheritance structure. I took a deep breath, organizing my thoughts. My grandmother created the trust 3 years before she died. The properties were placed in it with me as the sole beneficiary. When she passed, I became trustee as well. The Ridgewood estate was the centerpiece, a historic mansion that's been in our family for 4 generations. Grace nodded, making notes. And the marriage protections? That's where it gets interesting, I replied, pulling out a highlighted document. The trust stipulates that all properties remain separate from marital assets. Any transfer requires explicit documentation that I'm acting of my own free will, without coercion, and with full understanding of the property's value. Which you reinforced with the LLC formation last year, Grace added, examining another document. Yes. Mark thought it was just for tax purposes. He never read the operating agreement stating that I'm the only one with authority to transfer properties out of the LLC. And what's this? Grace asked, pointing to a document with the County Recorder's Office heading. That's the historical designation I secured for the Ridgewood estate last year. Mark thought I was just researching the property's history, my cute little hobby, he called it. He never realized I was actually getting the property officially designated as a historical landmark, which places significant restrictions on any renovations. I paused, swallowing hard. He and Natalie apparently have major renovation plans that would gut the original features. Plans that would never be approved under the historical designation. Grace leaned back, a slight smile playing at her lips. So even if they somehow managed to transfer the property, which they legally can't, they wouldn't be able to make the changes they want. Exactly. And the timeline? Grace asked, flipping through her notes. When are they planning to finalize this supposed purchase? According to Natalie's email this week. But there's more. I slid another folder across the table. This contains evidence that Mark has been moving funds from our joint accounts to a separate one in his name only. I think he's been planning this for months. Grace examined the bank statements, her expression hardening. These transfers, they're substantial. Yes, including the down payment I'd been saving for the Ridgewood renovations. Have you spoken to Harold Montgomery yet? Grace asked, referring to my grandmother's longtime friend and business partner. I'm meeting him after this. He's still on the Historical Society board and has connections with every real estate developer in Denver. Good. We'll need all the support we can get. Grace gathered the documents into organized piles. Rebecca, are you absolutely sure you want to do this? It's going to get messy. I walked to the window, gazing at the distant roofline of the Ridgewood estate. Do you know what Mark said the last time we visited the estate together? He said, "One day, Becca, I'll make this house everything you've dreamed of." Well, I'm done waiting for him to fulfill my dreams. I'm taking back what's already mine. Grace joined me at the window, her reflection serious in the glass. Then let's develop our strategy. First, we need to secure your financial position. Mark's going to be furious when he realizes what's happening. Already handled, I said, returning to the table and pulling out another folder. Remember those routine account adjustments we made 6 months ago? The ones Mark signed without reading because he was too busy planning his golf weekend. Grace's eyebrows rose as she reviewed the documents. You transferred majority ownership of your joint. Investments into your personal LLC? Mark always said I was too cautious, too focused on worst-case scenarios. He never understood that I learned from watching my mother lose everything. Just then, my phone buzzed with a text from Emily. Becca, Mark just called asking about your schedule. Says he can't reach you. What's going on? I showed the message to Grace, who frowned. He's getting nervous. Good. But we need to move fast. When is Thomas Rodriguez listing the Ridgewood estate? That's just it. He isn't. I spoke with him last night after getting Natalie's email. He has no idea what they're talking about. The property isn't listed for sale. So they're lying, Grace said, making another note. Or they found another agent. Either way, they can't sell what isn't theirs to sell. What about the Historical Society? Grace asked. Have you alerted them to potential inappropriate renovations? Better, I replied, pulling out one final document. I had lunch with the board last month. Mark never bothered to cultivate relationships with them, but I've spent years building connections. They're already concerned about maintaining the estate's historical integrity. You already have allies in place, Grace finished, nodding approvingly. But Rebecca, what about your other properties? If they're targeting the Ridgewood estate, they might try to move against the entire portfolio. I allowed myself a small smile. Remember that real estate management app Mark's been bragging about? The one that's supposedly going to streamline our property holdings? The one you actually developed while he took the credit? Exactly. What Mark doesn't know is that I programmed it to alert me to any unauthorized access attempts. He's tried to log into the property management system 3 times since yesterday, using incorrect passwords. Grace whistled softly. You've been preparing for this for a while, haven't you? Not this specifically, I admitted, sinking back into my chair. I never thought Mark would betray me like this, but I always knew I needed to protect myself. I watched too many women in my mother's generation lose everything because they trusted their husbands to do the right thing. My phone buzzed again. Another message from Natalie. Mark says you're not answering his calls. Don't make this difficult, Rebecca. You know he deserves this estate more than you do. He knows what to do with it. The audacity of her words made my blood boil, but I kept my voice steady as I read the message to Grace. They think I'm just going to roll over. Let them take everything. Everything I inherited. Everything I've worked for. They have no idea. What's coming? Grace gathered the documents into organized folders. But Rebecca, we need to discuss something else. The emotional cost. Are you ready for what this will do to your marriage? To your social circle? I thought about the dinner parties, the charity galas, the neighborhood events where I'd played, the role of the supportive wife, where I'd smiled and nodded as Mark took credit for my investment strategies and property management skills. You mean the people who've been watching Mark parade Natalie around for months without telling me? The ones who probably pitied poor, clueless Rebecca while her husband planned to steal her inheritance? No, I'm not worried about them. Grace's expression softened. And what about the Ridgewood estate itself? Is it worth all this? I turned back to the window, to the distant roofline visible against the mountain backdrop. It's not just about the house, Grace. It's about everything it represents. Every lesson my grandmother taught me. Every sacrifice she made to build. Her business as a woman in a man's world. Every time she told me never to let anyone take what's rightfully mine. The Ridgewood estate is my legacy. Then let's make sure it stays that way, Grace said, reaching for her phone. I'll file the injunction immediately. But Rebecca, she paused, making sure she had my full attention. This is going to get messy before it gets better. Mark won't go down without a fight. I thought about the emails from Natalie, about Mark taking her to our special places, about them planning to renovate my family's historic mansion without any respect for its history or significance. My voice was steel when I replied, Good, because neither will I. As Grace made her calls, I pulled out my phone and finally typed a response to Natalie. Enjoy your renovation plans with Mark, but I'd hold off on ordering any fixtures if I were you. Then I blocked her number and turned to the task at hand. By the time Mark realized what was happening, it would be too late. The Ridgewood estate would remain with its rightful owner, and it wouldn't be the man who'd broken every promise he'd ever made to me. It would be the woman who had been underestimated for far too long. The next 48 hours became a blur of strategic meetings and careful documentation. After leaving Grace's office, I found myself sitting across from Harold Montgomery in the quiet study of his Cherry Creek home, surrounded by photographs of Denver's architectural history, including several of my grandmother and the Ridgewood estate. I couldn't believe it when you called, Harold said, his voice grave as he examined the emails from Natalie. Your grandmother would be furious. She specifically left the Ridgewood to you because she knew you understood its historical significance. Mark and Natalie apparently have other ideas, I replied, showing him the renovation sketches Emily had managed to photograph at the Copper Kettle that morning. They want to modernize it, remove the original woodwork, reconfigure the rooms, essentially strip away everything that makes it special. Harold studied the sketches with growing horror. This would destroy the architectural integrity completely. The Historical Preservation Board would never approve these changes. That's what I'm counting on, I said. Even if they somehow manage to gain control of the property, which they legally can't, they wouldn't be able to make these changes. The board meets tomorrow, Harold said, making notes in his leather-bound planner. I'll make sure these plans are brought to their attention immediately. But Rebecca, have you spoken with Thomas about this? As the listing agent for all your properties, he should be informed. I'm meeting him next, I confirmed. I need to understand exactly what Mark has been telling people about the sale. As I prepared to leave, Harold placed a weathered hand on mine. Your grandmother saw something special in you, Rebecca. She knew you had the strength to protect her legacy. Don't let Mark or anyone else make you doubt that. His words strengthened my resolve as I headed to my next meeting. Thomas Rodriguez met me at his downtown office, his expression troubled, as he reviewed the emails from Natalie. Rebecca, I've been your family's real estate agent for 20 years. I would never list the Ridgewood without your explicit authorization. Whatever Mark is telling people, it isn't coming through me. Then who? I asked, perplexed. Natalie seemed certain they were finalizing the paperwork this week. Thomas tapped his computer keyboard, bringing up the Denver real estate listings database. Let me check something. After a moment, his eyebrows shot up. Interesting. There's a private listing for a historic estate in Denver's prestigious Heritage District with Caroline Walsh as the agent. Caroline Walsh? The name was familiar. Isn't she the agent who handled that controversial development in Highland last year? The one where they demolished a historic building despite preservation protests? Thomas nodded grimly. The very one. She specializes in, let's say, creative interpretations of historical property restrictions. Can you find out more about this listing? Already on it. Thomas made a quick call, speaking in low tones before hanging up with a satisfied expression. My contact at Walsh's office confirms they're representing a couple planning to purchase and renovate a historic property. The male client mentioned his wife was too sentimental about the property's current state to be involved in the modernization plans. My blood boiled at Mark's audacity. He's pretending I'm on board with selling my own inheritance? It appears so. But Rebecca, Thomas leaned forward, his expression serious. This works in our favor. It's clear evidence of fraudulent intent. By late afternoon, I had compiled a comprehensive file documenting every aspect of Mark and Natalie's scheme. As I organized the evidence, a text from Grace provided the next piece of the puzzle. Injunction filed, County Recorder's Office. Has been alerted to potential fraudulent transfer attempts. Any paperwork Mark tries to file will be flagged. I could imagine Mark's frustration when he discovered his plans blocked at every turn. He had always been dismissive of bureaucratic red tape, never understanding that those legal structures were what protected property rights in the first place. As evening approached, I received notification that Mark had tried to access our joint investment account, the account I'd quietly transferred to my protected LLC months earlier. Another text followed, this time from Emily. Just overheard Mark on the phone at the Aspen and Oak. He sounded stressed, talking about unexpected complications with the property transfer. Natalie looked furious. The Aspen and Oak, the restaurant, where Mark had proposed to me. The restaurant where we'd celebrated when my grandmother had officially transferred the Ridgewood estate to my name. Of course he would take Natalie there, continuing to rewrite our history while planning to steal my legacy. I spent the evening with Emily, explaining everything that had happened since that early morning email from Natalie. As we sat in my living room, the city lights twinkling beyond the windows, Emily's expression shifted from shock to fierce pride. He never deserved you, Becca, or the Ridgewood estate. Later that night, after Emily left, I stood at my window looking out at the city. Somewhere out there, Mark was realizing that his carefully laid plans were unraveling. Somewhere, Natalie was discovering that the inheritance she thought was ripe for the taking was protected by legal structures she couldn't begin to understand. Let them panic. Let them scramble. By this time tomorrow, they would learn that some legacies can't be stolen, and some women can't be underestimated. The morning of the Historical Preservation Board meeting dawned clear and cold, the kind of crisp Denver winter day that showcased the Ridgewood Estate's distinctive architecture against the brilliant blue sky. I arrived early, choosing a seat, at the back of the meeting room where I could observe without being immediately noticed. The room filled quickly with board members, preservationists, and interested citizens. Harold nodded to me discreetly as he took his place at the board table. At precisely 9 a.m., Caroline Walsh entered, followed by Mark and Natalie, all three looking confident as they prepared their presentation materials. They hadn't seen me yet. "Good morning, everyone," the board chairman began. "Today we're reviewing several proposals, beginning with the renovation plans for the historic Ridgewood Estate. Ms. Walsh, I believe you're representing the prospective buyers?" Caroline stepped forward, every inch the polished real estate agent. "Yes, Mr. Chairman. My clients, Mark Wilson and Natalie Palmer, are excited to present their vision for revitalizing this important Denver landmark." Mark moved to the podium, his expression smug as he began his presentation. "Ladies and gentlemen, the Ridgewood Estate represents a unique opportunity to blend historical charm with modern living. Our plans honor the property's legacy while bringing it into the 21st century." The lights dimmed as Mark projected renderings onto the screen, images showing the estate stripped of its original features, its distinctive elements replaced with sleek contemporary designs. "As you can see," Natalie added, stepping forward to point at particularly dramatic changes, "we're opening up the confined spaces, replacing the outdated fixtures, and creating a more functional floor plan for today's lifestyle." I watched the board members' expressions shift from polite interest to barely concealed horror as Mark and Natalie enthusiastically detailed their plans to gut one of Denver's most significant historical properties. "The cost is substantial," Mark concluded, "but we're prepared to make this investment to transform the Ridgewood into a showpiece of modern design." "Are there any questions?" the chairman asked, his voice carefully neutral. Harold raised his hand. "Yes, Mr. Wilson, could you explain how these plans comply with the historical designation requirements, particularly given the property's Grade 2 listed status?" Mark's confident smile faltered slightly. "Listed status? I was under the impression that was still pending approval." "Actually," Harold replied, consulting his notes, "the Ridgewood Estate received its historical designation last year. The application was quite thorough, including detailed documentation of all original features that must be preserved." Natalie leaned over to whisper something to Mark, whose face had begun to pale. "Furthermore," another board member added, "our records indicate that any substantial changes to the property require the explicit consent of the owner of record. Do you have that documentation with you today?" "Of course," Caroline Walsh interjected smoothly. "We're in the process of finalizing the purchase from the current owner, who fully supports these renovation plans." That was my cue. I stood up, feeling every eye in the room turned toward me as I walked to the front. "I'm afraid that's not accurate," I said, my voice clear and steady. Mark's head snapped up, his face draining of color as he recognized me. "Rebecca, what are you doing here?" "I'm here because you're attempting to present renovation plans for a property you don't own, and never will." Caroline Walsh looked between us, confusion evident on her face. "Mr. Wilson assured me that his wife was supportive of the sale and renovations." "I'm sure he did," I replied calmly. Unfortunately, Mark neglected to mention several important details. I opened my portfolio and distributed copies of key documents to the board members. First, the Ridgewood Estate isn't marital property. It was left to me by my grandmother through a trust that explicitly keeps it separate from marital assets. I placed another document on the table. Second, I am the sole member of the LLC that holds title to the property, with exclusive rights to approve any transfer. Mark stood up, his face flushed with anger. This is ridiculous, Rebecca. You're just trying to interfere because you're jealous of Natalie. I smiled, placing the final document on the table. And third, as the legally registered owner who obtained the historical designation, I'm informing the board that I do not approve these renovation plans. In fact, I have my own proposal for preserving the Ridgewood estate. Harold nodded to me. The board would be very interested in seeing those plans, Ms. Wilson. For the next 30 minutes, I presented my vision for the Ridgewood estate, not one of destruction disguised as modernization, but of careful restoration that honored my grandmother's legacy while ensuring the property's historical significance would be protected for generations to come. As I concluded, the board chairman cleared his throat. Thank you, Ms. Wilson. I think it's clear that there's been some confusion regarding the ownership and future of the Ridgewood estate. Caroline Walsh was already gathering her materials, her expression professional but her movements stiff with embarrassment. Natalie looked shell-shocked, her earlier confidence completely evaporated. Mark stepped toward me, lowering his voice to a harsh whisper. You planned this? Set me up to look like a fool? No, Mark, I replied quietly. You did that all by yourself when you tried to steal my inheritance. As the meeting adjourned, Harold approached with several board members. Rebecca, the board is unanimously impressed with your preservation plans. We'd like to schedule a special session next week to discuss them in detail. Mark and Natalie stood frozen, watching as I accepted congratulations from the preservation community. Their dream of modernizing my family's historic home was crumbling before their eyes. Before leaving, I approached Caroline Walsh. I believe you were misinformed about the property's availability. Perhaps in the future, you might verify ownership before preparing sales listings. Her professional mask slipped for just a moment. He said you were on board. Said it was a surprise renovation for your anniversary. I smiled coldly. Mark has always been creative with the truth. Unfortunately for him, property law deals in facts, not fiction. As I walked out of the meeting room, Mark caught up to me in the hallway, his earlier anger now replaced with desperation. Rebecca, wait. We need to talk about this. I can explain everything. There's nothing to explain, I replied, continuing toward the exit. Your emails with Natalie and Caroline made your intentions perfectly clear. Those properties are partially mine, he insisted, grabbing my arm. I'm entitled to half of everything. I stopped and looked pointedly at his hand until he released, me. Actually, you're not. But don't worry. I've instructed Grace to send over the divorce papers this afternoon. You'll find that everything is meticulously documented. Natalie appeared behind him, her voice shrill with panic. Mark, do something. We've already paid deposits on the renovation materials. Non-refundable deposits. I left them arguing in the hallway. Non-refundable deposits. I left them arguing in the hallway, walking out into the bright Denver morning with my head held high. By the time I reached my car, my phone was buzzing with messages from Grace, Emily, and Harold, all confirming that the next phases of our plan were in motion. The Ridgewood estate was secure, my inheritance was protected, and Mark and Natalie were about to discover just how thoroughly they had underestimated me. 2 months later, I stood on the wide veranda of the Ridgewood estate, watching as the historical preservation team carefully restored the original woodwork that Mark and Natalie had planned to tear out. The spring sunshine warmed the aged brick, highlighting the distinctive architectural features that made the mansion unique. The restoration is coming along beautifully, Harold commented, joining me by the ornate railing. The Historical Society is using your project as a model for other preservation efforts in the city. I smiled, remembering how different this veranda had looked in Mark and Natalie's modernization plans. Now, instead of the sleek, contemporary space they had envisioned, it remained true to its original design, a testament to craftsmanship that had endured for generations. "Have you heard the latest?" Emily asked, approaching with a stack of real estate magazines. "Natalie's been blacklisted by most of the legitimate developers in Denver. Apparently, attempting to fraudulently acquire a historically designated property didn't do much for her professional reputation." I picked up one of the magazines, where my restoration project was featured in a prominent article. "And Mark?" "Still trying to salvage what he can," Emily replied. "But since everyone now knows who really built your investment portfolio, he's finding it difficult to be taken seriously in real estate circles." Grace arrived next, a folder tucked under her arm. "The divorce is final," she announced without preamble. "As we predicted, Mark didn't contest the property division once he realized how thoroughly the documentation supported your claims." Thomas Rodriguez joined our small gathering, champagne glasses balanced carefully on a silver tray. "I think this calls for a celebration," he said, distributing the glasses. "To Rebecca, who never forgot what her grandmother taught her." We toasted on the veranda of what was now indisputably my home, the home that had been in my family for generations, the home that Mark and Natalie had tried to claim as their own. "The Historical Society has approved your full restoration plan," Harold announced, his eyes bright with satisfaction. "They're particularly impressed with your commitment to using original materials and traditional techniques." I gazed out at the sprawling grounds where the garden restoration team was already preparing the soil for heritage plants that would match the estate's original landscaping. In the distance, I could see the distinctive outline of the greenhouse where my grandmother had taught me about preservation, not just of buildings, but of history, of legacy, of self-worth. "Did you see the latest Denver Business Journal?" Grace asked, pulling out her tablet. "They're running a feature on female property developers, starting with your grandmother and ending with you. They're calling you the preservation pioneer." I smiled, thinking of how proud my grandmother would be. She had faced so much opposition in her day, so many men who had tried to dismiss her, underestimate her, push her aside. Yet she had persevered, building a legacy that now continued through me. Emily linked her arm through mine as we watched the preservation team at work. "You know, when you first told me about Mark and Natalie, I thought you would just want revenge. But you've done something better. You've honored Grandma's memory in the most perfect way possible." She was right. In choosing preservation over destruction, restoration over revenge, I had written a different story for myself. Not a tale of a woman scorned, but of a legacy reclaimed and protected. As twilight settled over the Ridgewood estate, turning the windows to gold and the shadows to velvet, I felt a sense of completion. The journey that had begun with that devastating email from Natalie had led me here, to a stronger sense of purpose, a clearer vision of my path forward, and a deeper connection to my family's legacy. The Ridgewood estate stood proud against the darkening sky, its restored features a testament not just to historical significance, but to the power of preparation, determination, and the refusal to be underestimated. Mark and Natalie had thought they were writing a love story at my expense. They hadn't realized they were merely footnotes in a much more powerful narrative, one about legacy, preservation, and a woman who knew her true worth. The following morning brought a flurry of activity to the Ridgewood estate. The preservation team arrived early, their voices echoing through the grand entrance hall as they discussed the day's restoration priorities. I walked through the rooms, now humming with productive energy, marveling at how different this felt from the quiet emptiness that had characterized the house for so long. "We've found something interesting behind the library paneling," called Eliza, the lead preservationist. "You might want to see this." I followed her into what had been my grandmother's favorite room, a 2-story library with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and a rolling ladder that I had loved to climb as a child. The team had carefully removed a section of ornate wood paneling, revealing a small hidden compartment. It was common in houses of this era to include secret storage spaces, Eliza explained, gesturing to the opening, usually for valuables or important documents. Inside the compartment was a dusty metal box. With gloved hands, Eliza carefully lifted it out and placed it on the library table. The box was locked, its surface engraved with my grandmother's initials, AGW, Adelaide Grace Wilson. "Do you have a key that might fit this?" Eliza asked, studying the antique lock. I touched my grandmother's pearl necklace, which I had worn every day since discovering Mark's betrayal. The small pendant that hung from it had always seemed decorative, but now I looked at it with new eyes. Could it be? Carefully, I detached the pendant from the necklace and inserted it into the lock. It fit perfectly, turning with a satisfying click. The lid opened to reveal a collection of journals, letters, and small, leather-bound notebooks. "Your grandmother's private papers," Harold breathed, having joined us in the library. "Adelaide was always documenting everything, much like you." I lifted out the topmost journal, its pages yellowed with age, but the handwriting unmistakably my grandmother's bold, confident script. The entry was dated 50 years earlier. "Today, I purchased the Ridgewood estate despite Walter's objections. He believes it's too grand, too expensive, too ambitious for a woman's project. He doesn't understand that this isn't about a house. It's about creating a legacy that can't be taken away. Something I can pass to my granddaughters that will remind them of their own worth." Tears pricked my eyes as I read her words. Even half a century ago, my grandmother had been thinking of me, planning for my future, ensuring I would have something that was truly mine. "Rebecca!" called a voice from the entrance hall. Thomas Rodriguez stood there, his expression both apologetic and amused. "You have visitors." Behind him stood Mark and a woman I didn't recognize, not Natalie, but someone older, more professionally dressed, with a portfolio clutched tightly under her arm. "I apologize for the interruption," Thomas continued, but Mr. Wilson was quite insistent. I closed my grandmother's journal and handed it to Harold for safekeeping. "It's all right, Thomas. We can receive them in the morning room." The morning room was the smallest of the formal reception rooms, deliberately intimate and with only 2 antique chairs available for visitors, designed to keep unwelcome guests from lingering. I seated myself behind the delicate writing desk, a position of authority in the small space. Mark looked distinctly uncomfortable, his usual confidence replaced by a nervous energy that manifested in his shifting stance and darting eyes. The woman with him maintained a professional demeanor, though her tight grip on her portfolio betrayed her own tension. "Rebecca," Mark began, his voice attempting its old, confident tone but falling somewhat short. "This is Patricia Vega, my financial advisor. We need to discuss some aspects of our property division." I raised an eyebrow, saying nothing, allowing the silence to stretch uncomfortably. Patricia Vega cleared her throat. "Ms. Wilson, I've been working with Mr. Wilson to assess his financial position following your separation. There appears to be some confusion regarding the ownership structure of several investment properties." "There's no confusion," I replied calmly. "The ownership structures are clearly documented in the divorce settlement you both received last week." "Yes, but," Mark interjected, his voice rising slightly before he caught himself. "The Denver Heights development properties. I was the one who negotiated those deals." "You were present at some meetings," I corrected. "The actual negotiations, financial modeling, and contract structures were my work, as the documentation clearly shows." Patricia opened her portfolio and extracted several papers. "Mr. Wilson has provided me with these documents showing his signature on the purchase agreements." I smiled slightly. "Yes, his signature is on the final agreements. But if you look at the ownership structure filed with the recorder's office, you'll see that the properties are held by Wilson Legacy LLC, of which I am the sole managing member with 85% ownership interest. Mark's face flushed with anger. That's not what we agreed to. It's exactly what you signed, I countered, opening my laptop and turning it to show them the digital copies of the fully executed agreements. Page 6, paragraph 4, clearly outlines the ownership structure. You initialed it here, here, and here. Patricia studied the documents with growing concern, while Mark's expression cycled through disbelief, anger, and finally, desperate calculation. Rebecca, he said, his voice softening into the persuasive tone he had once used so effectively. On me. Surely we can work something out. We built this portfolio together. I helped you manage these properties for years. Did you? I asked, pulling up another file. Here are the management records for the past 5 years. My signature on every decision document. My email address on every correspondence with tenants. My phone number on every service call report. Your contribution appears to have been limited to attending the annual investor dinner and claiming credit for the financial returns. Patricia Vega closed her portfolio with a snap that seemed to echo her frustration. Mr. Wilson, you assured me that you were the primary decision-maker for these properties. I was, Mark insisted, a note of desperation entering his voice. Rebecca was just handling the paperwork. Just the paperwork, I repeated softly. Like the paperwork that established ownership? The paperwork that protected my inheritance? The paperwork that you never bothered to read because you thought it was beneath you? A knock at the door interrupted us. Emily entered, her timing impeccable as always. I'm sorry to interrupt, she said, not sounding sorry at all. But the Historical Society board members have arrived for their tour of the restoration work. Mark looked around wildly, seeming to fully register for the first time the extent of the work already underway at the Ridgewood estate. The preservation team's careful activity, the architectural consultants measuring and documenting, the skilled craftsmen repairing original features, all of it representing an investment and commitment that had happened without his knowledge. Or involvement. You've already started renovations? He asked incredulously. How are you funding this without access to our joint accounts? I exchanged a glance with Emily, who didn't bother to hide her smirk. Mark, I think you've misunderstood. Something fundamental? I never needed access to our accounts to fund this project. My grandmother left me more than just properties. Understanding dawned on his face. The investment portfolio, the one you said was tied up in long-term growth instruments, was always separate from our marital assets, I finished for him. Just like these properties, just like this estate. Patricia Vega was already gathering her things, her professional demeanor barely concealing her irritation with Mark. Mr. Wilson, I think we need to reassess your financial position before proceeding further. It appears there are significant discrepancies in what you've represented to me. As they prepared to leave, Mark turned back, his expression a mixture of anger and something that might have been grudging respect. How long have you been planning this? He demanded. How long have you been setting me up to fail? I looked at him steadily, remembering all the years I had supported his career, corrected his mistakes, strengthened his position while allowing him to take credit for my work. I wasn't planning for you to fail, Mark. I was planning for me to succeed, regardless of what you did. There's a difference. After they left, Emily linked her arm through mine as we walked back to the library. Do you think he finally gets it? That he understands what he lost? I thought about Mark's face as he looked around the estate, not with the possessive entitlement he had shown before, but with the dawning recognition of something valuable that had slipped forever beyond his reach. I think he's beginning to, I replied. But honestly, it doesn't matter anymore. This isn't about Mark or what he understands. It's about honoring what grandmother built and continuing her legacy. In the library, Harold waited with my grandmother's journals spread carefully on acid-free paper to protect the delicate pages. You might want to see this, he said, pointing to an entry dated shortly after my birth. Adelaide was quite prescient. The journal entry read, "Held baby Rebecca today. Eleanor says she has William's eyes, but I see something else in her, a determination, a steadiness even as an infant. She watches everything, misses nothing. One day this little one will protect the legacy I'm building, not because she needs to, but because she'll understand its true value." I traced my grandmother's handwriting with a gentle finger, feeling a connection that transcended time. She had seen something in me even then, had been preparing me for this moment long before I knew such preparation would be necessary. The Historical Society members gathered in the grand entrance hall, their expressions appreciative as they noted the careful restoration already underway. I joined them, ready to guide them through the house that was both my inheritance and my responsibility. "As you can see," I began, gesturing to the original moldings being meticulously repaired, "we're not just preserving the physical structure, but the craftsmanship and architectural intentions that make the Ridgewood estate historically significant." As I led them through the house, explaining the restoration techniques, the historical research, and the plans for future preservation, I felt a sense of rightness, of purpose. This was what my grandmother had intended when she left me the estate, not just ownership of a valuable property, but stewardship of a legacy. Later that afternoon, as the various teams wrapped up their day's work, I found myself alone in my grandmother's library, the hidden compartment still open, her journals still waiting to be fully explored. I settled into the window seat, the same spot where she had often read to me as a child, and opened the earliest volume. The first entry, dated nearly 60 years earlier, began. "Purchased my first property today, despite everyone telling me. A woman has no business in real estate. The bank manager suggested I get my husband's permission first. I suggested he check the funds in my account before making further antiquated recommendations. He was considerably more helpful after that." I smiled, recognizing the same determination that had carried me through the past difficult months, the same refusal to be underestimated or dismissed, the same understanding that true power came not from confrontation, but from careful preparation and absolute certainty in one's own value. My phone chimed with a text from Grace. "Final property transfers completed today. All assets now securely in your name or the appropriate LLCs. Mark has no further legal claims on any of the properties." Another text followed, this one from Thomas. "Just heard from Caroline Walsh. She's dropped Mark as a client after discovering the extent of his misrepresentations. Apparently, his financial situation is precarious now that he no longer has access to your investment income." I felt no satisfaction at Mark's downfall, no vindictive pleasure in his difficulties. What I felt instead was liberation, freedom from the need for his approval, from the habit of diminishing my own contributions, from the pattern of allowing him to take credit for my work and ideas. The evening sun slanted through the library, windows, illuminating the room in a warm golden glow that highlighted the careful craftsmanship of the restored woodwork. Outside, the gardens were beginning to show signs of renewal as the landscaping team cleared away years of neglect to reveal the original design my grandmother had created. Emily found me there as twilight gathered, bringing 2 glasses of wine and a quiet companionship that required no words. We sat together in the window seat, watching as lights came on in the distant city, each of us lost in our own thoughts. "I was so worried about you when you first got that email," Emily finally said, breaking the comfortable silence. "I thought Mark had broken you." I considered her words, remembering the shock, the pain, the momentary paralysis that had followed. Natalie's casual cruelty. Those feelings had been real, the hurt genuine. But they hadn't broken me. If anything, they had stripped away the last of my illusions, forcing me to see clearly what I had perhaps always known. That Mark valued what? I could provide him far more than he valued me. "He didn't break me," I replied. "He just showed me who he really was. And in doing so, He reminded me who I really am. Emily nodded, understanding in her eyes. Grandmother's granddaughter, the keeper of the legacy. Something like that? I agreed, taking a sip of wine and feeling the warmth spread through me, matching the growing sense of certainty I had about my path forward. My phone buzzed again, this time with a message from an unfamiliar number. The text was brief. "I'm sorry. I didn't know about your grandmother's trust or what the house meant to you. Mark lied to me too. Natalie." I showed the message to Emily, who scoffed. As if that excuses her? She was still trying to take something that wasn't hers. True, I acknowledged. But in a way, I almost feel sorry for her. Mark convinced her she was getting a fresh start, a dream home, a new life. Instead, she got a costly lesson about the man she thought she loved. "Are you going to respond?" Emily asked. I considered it for a moment, then shook my head. There's nothing to say. She made her choices. I made mine. Now we both live with the consequences. As night fell fully, wrapping the Ridgewood estate in darkness, relieved only by the strategic lighting that highlighted its architectural features, I felt a sense of completion. The journey that had begun with that devastating email from Natalie had come full circle, bringing me back to the house my grandmother had preserved for me, the legacy she had prepared me to protect. The Ridgewood estate stood solid and enduring. In the night, its structures reinforced, its features restored, its future secured. Like me, it had weathered attempts to change its fundamental nature, to erase its history, to remake it into something it was never meant to be. And like me, it had emerged not just intact, but strengthened, its true character more clearly defined, its value more deeply appreciated, its purpose more firmly established. Outside, the Denver night pulsed with activity, with lives intersecting and diverging, with stories being written and rewritten in countless ways. Mark was out there somewhere, perhaps beginning to understand the true cost of underestimating the woman he had married. Natalie was there too, learning her own difficult lessons about trust and verification. But here, in my grandmother's house, in the library where she had taught me about legacy and value and self-worth, I was exactly where I belonged. The custodian of a history that stretched backward into the past and forward into a future that was mine to shape. The next morning, I woke to the sound of gentle rain against the windows. Spring rain, the kind that nourishes new growth and washes away winter's remnants. I dressed carefully for the day ahead, choosing a vintage silk blouse that had been my grandmother's, pairing it with a contemporary suit that reflected my own modern sensibilities. The combination seemed appropriate for a day dedicated to bridging past and future, to honoring history while creating something new. Today was the official launch of the Wilson Heritage Foundation, the organization I had established to ensure the Ridgewood estate's historical significance would be protected long after I was gone. Board members would be arriving at 10, followed by representatives from Denver's Historical Society, Preservation Community, and architectural associations. The foundation's mission went beyond just maintaining one historic property. It was dedicated to preserving architectural heritage throughout the city, providing grants for restoration projects, educational resources for historical conservation, and advocacy for preservation policies. As I fastened my grandmother's pearl necklace, the one containing the key that had unlocked her hidden journals, I caught my reflection in the mirror. The woman looking back at me was changed from the one who had received Natalie's devastating email just months ago. She stood straighter, her gaze more direct, her expression more certain. This wasn't just about reclaiming what Mark had tried to take. It was about claiming something I had never fully embraced before, my own power, my own vision, my own right to define my legacy. A knock at the bedroom door announced Emily's arrival. She entered carrying a small package wrapped in cream-colored paper. "This just arrived for you," she said, handing me the parcel. "Special delivery." The return address showed Harold Montgomery's name and distinctive handwriting. Inside the package was a small, leather-bound book with no title on its cover. A note from Harold explained, "Found this in Adelaide's safety deposit box when closing. Out some old accounts. Thought you should have it before today's launch." The book contained handwritten entries in my grandmother's bold script, but unlike her personal journals, this was clearly a professional document, a record of her earliest property acquisitions, her strategy for building her portfolio, her long-term vision for what would become her legacy. On the final page, dated just weeks before her death, she had written, "All of this, the properties, the investments, the Ridgewood estate itself, these are not merely assets to be passed down. They are tools for independence, guarantees of autonomy, foundations for strength." Rebecca will understand this, I think. She has always seen beyond the surface of things, always recognized the difference between appearance and reality. This legacy is not about wealth, but about freedom. The freedom to determine one's own path regardless of others' expectations or demands. I traced her words with my fingertip, feeling their truth resonate through me. My grandmother hadn't left me properties. She had left me independence. She hadn't given me buildings. She had given me foundations. Not just physical foundations of stone and wood, but emotional and intellectual foundations, the knowledge and confidence to stand firmly on my own terms. Emily glanced at her watch. "The caterers are here and Harold just pulled up. Are you ready?" I closed the book carefully, placing it on my bedside table where I could return to it later. More than ready. The morning room, where just yesterday I had faced down Mark, and his financial advisor, had been transformed into a reception area. The grand dining room beyond was set up for the Foundation's inaugural board meeting. Throughout the house, discreet signage explained the historical significance of each room and the restoration techniques being employed. As I greeted the arriving guests, accepting congratulations and fielding questions about the Foundation's mission, I was struck by how differently I moved through these spaces now. This wasn't just a house I had inherited. It was a purpose I had embraced, a calling I had answered. Harold approached, resplendent in a vintage suit that complemented the house's historical atmosphere. "Adelaide would be so proud," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Not just of what you've saved, but of what you're creating." The board meeting proceeded smoothly, with unanimous approval for the Foundation's initial grant programs and educational initiatives. As the newly elected board chair, I outlined our vision for the future, a future that honored the past without being constrained by it, that preserved what was valuable while creating new significance for future generations. After the meeting, as guests toured the ongoing restoration work, Thomas Rodriguez pulled me aside, his expression troubled. "Rebecca, I don't want to disrupt your day, but there's something you should know. Mark came to my office yesterday after leaving here. He wanted me to approach you about a settlement, a lump sum payment in exchange for him relinquishing any future claims on your properties." I raised an eyebrow. "What did you tell him?" "That he has no claims to relinquish," Thomas replied with a slight smile, "and that if he persists in suggesting otherwise, he might find himself facing fraud charges for his attempts to sell property he didn't own." I nodded, unsurprised. Mark's sense of entitlement had always been his blind spot, preventing him from recognizing boundaries or accepting limitations. "There's more," Thomas continued. "He mentioned that Natalie has left him. Apparently, discovering his true financial situation and the extent of his misrepresentations was the final straw. This news did surprise me somewhat. I had assumed Natalie was as opportunistic as Mark, willing to overlook his character flaws in exchange for the lifestyle and status she thought he could provide. "That's unfortunate for him," I said, finding that I meant it. Not because I harbored any lingering affection for Mark, but because I recognized the hollow emptiness that awaited someone who had built their life on false premises and superficial values. As the afternoon progressed, I found myself gravitating toward the library, seeking a moment of quiet reflection amidst the day's activities. I stood by the window, looking out at the gardens where spring's renewal was evident in every fresh, green shoot and early blossom. A year ago, this view had been different. The gardens had been neglected, the house had been empty, and I had been a different person. Someone who allowed her contributions to be minimized, her ideas to be credited. To others, her worth to be determined by external validation. The woman who stood here now understood something her grandmother had known all along. That true value comes not from what others recognize, but from what you yourself create and protect. That legacy isn't just what you inherit, but what you build upon that foundation. That strength isn't about dominating others, but about standing firmly in your own truth, regardless of who tries to undermine it. Grace found me there, a legal folder tucked under her arm and satisfaction evident in her expression. "It's official," she said without preamble. "The last of Mark's appeals has been dismissed. The court has fully affirmed the property division, as outlined in our filings. There are no more legal challenges he can mount." I accepted this news with a calm nod, finding that it brought neither elation nor relief, simply a quiet confirmation of what I had already known to be true. "Thank you, Grace, not just for the legal work, but for believing in me even when I wasn't sure I believed in myself." She smiled, squeezing my arm affectionately. "I didn't have to believe in you, Rebecca. I just had to remind you to believe in yourself. Everything else, the legal strategy, the documentation, the careful planning, that was all you. You were preparing for this moment long before you knew it would come." As evening approached and the day's events wound down, I found myself once more in the library, this time with Emily, Grace, Harold, and Thomas, the inner circle who had supported me through the challenges of the past months. "A toast," Harold proposed, raising his glass, "to Adelaide Wilson, who built the foundation, and to Rebecca Wilson, who has built upon it something even stronger." We clinked glasses, the crystal ringing clear in the book-lined room that had been my grandmother's sanctuary and was now becoming mine. Later, after the others had gone, I returned to the library alone. The house settled around me with familiar creaks and sighs, sounds that had once seemed eerie in their emptiness, but now felt comforting in their continuity. My phone buzzed with a final message for the day, from an unknown number that I recognized as Mark's new line, "I understand now what I lost." Not just the properties or the money, but you, your intelligence, your foresight, your strength. "I'm sorry I didn't see it sooner." I read the message twice, acknowledging its truth without feeling any particular emotion. Mark had indeed lost something valuable when he betrayed me, but his recognition came too late to matter. I had already moved beyond the need for his acknowledgement, beyond the desire for his approval, beyond the habit of measuring my worth through his estimation. I didn't respond to his text. There was nothing to say that hadn't already been said through my actions, through the foundation's launch, through the restored Ridgewood estate that stood as testimony to my grandmother's vision and my determination. Outside, the spring rain continued its gentle patter against the windows, nourishing new growth in the gardens below. Inside, surrounded by my grandmother's books and her recently discovered journals, I felt a sense of connection that stretched backward through time and forward into future possibilities. The Ridgewood estate had weathered many storms in its long history. Architectural trends that might have stripped it of its character, development pressures that might have demolished it entirely, neglect that might have left it to decay beyond. Recovery. Yet it had survived, its essential nature intact, its significance recognized and protected. In that way, it was a fitting symbol for my own journey. From the woman who had received that devastating email from Natalie to the woman who now stood firmly as the custodian of her own legacy. I, too, had weathered attempts to diminish my value, to erase my contributions, to remake me into something more convenient for others' narratives. And I, too, had emerged stronger for the challenge, my true character more clearly defined, my value more deeply understood, not just by others, but by myself. The rain slowed and stopped as night deepened, the clouds parting to reveal a sky brilliant with stars. I moved to the window, looking out at the Denver skyline and the mountains beyond, feeling a sense of possibility that extended as far as the horizon. My grandmother had built something lasting. I had protected it. Now I would build upon it, creating a legacy that would extend beyond physical properties to encompass values, principles, and a vision for preserving what matters most. Mark and Natalie had thought they were writing a simple story, one where they took what they wanted, at my expense, where they discarded history for their own convenience, where they treated legacy as something to be claimed rather than earned. They hadn't realized they were merely supporting characters in a much larger narrative, one about the strength that comes from knowing your own worth, the power that comes from careful preparation, and the victory that comes not from defeating others, but from standing firmly in your own truth. As I turned away from the window, my gaze fell on my grandmother's portrait above the library fireplace. She looked back at me with eyes that seemed to hold both approval and expectation, acknowledgement of what I had already accomplished, and anticipation of what I would do next. I smiled at her image, feeling the weight of the pearl necklace against my collarbone, the key to her hidden journals, now a symbol of the unlocked potential she had always seen in me. I understand now, I said softly to her portrait. It was never just about the properties. It was about building something that couldn't be taken away. And in protecting my inheritance from those who would have claimed it, I had claimed something far more valuable: my own strength, my own vision, my own right to determine the legacy I would leave behind. 6 months after the launch of the Wilson Heritage Foundation, the Ridgewood estate had transformed from a neglected historical property into a vibrant center for preservation education and community engagement. As autumn painted the surrounding trees in brilliant shades of gold and crimson, I stood in what had once been my grandmother's study, now converted into the foundation's administrative office, watching as a group of architecture students carefully documented the original crown molding. "That's authentic 1890s craftsmanship," explained Harold to the students, his voice carrying the authority of decades spent studying historical properties. "Notice the hand-carved detailing. You won't find that level of artistry in modern construction." The students nodded, their expressions rapt as they sketched and photographed the intricate designs. This was the 3rd student group this month, part of the Foundation's educational outreach program that had quickly gained recognition among Denver's universities and technical schools. A discreet knock at the door announced Grace's arrival. She entered with her characteristic efficiency, leather portfolio tucked under one arm, her expression suggesting she had important news. "The final paperwork for the Henderson House acquisition has been approved," she said without preamble. "Congratulations, Rebecca. The Foundation has just saved another historic Denver property from demolition." The Henderson House, a queen and Victorian that had been slated for replacement by a modern condominium complex, would be the Foundation's 2nd full restoration project. Its salvation represented not just the preservation of Denver's architectural heritage, but the expanding influence of what had begun as a personal mission to protect my grandmother's legacy. "That's wonderful news," I replied, feeling a surge of satisfaction. "Have you informed the Community Preservation Committee? They've been anxiously waiting for confirmation." Grace nodded, her smile widening. "I called Eleanor Mills first thing this morning. She's already organizing a neighborhood celebration for this weekend." As Grace departed to finalize the acquisition details, I moved to the window, gazing out at the gardens where a landscape team was completing the restoration of my grandmother's original design. The formal rose garden had been reclaimed from years of neglect, the fountain at its center functioning once again, the gravel paths renewed and clearly defined. Beyond the immediate grounds, the Denver skyline rose against the backdrop of mountains, a visual reminder of the contrast between historical preservation and modern development, not necessarily in opposition, but existing in a careful balance that required conscious stewardship. My phone chimed with an incoming email notification. Confirmation that my article on adaptive reuse of historical properties had been accepted for publication in the National Preservation Journal. Another boundary crossed. Another professional achievement that established me not just as the heiress to my grandmother's properties, but as an authority in my own right in the preservation community. How different this moment was from that dark early morning when I had received Natalie's cruel message. Then, I had felt the momentary vertigo of betrayal, the disorientation of realizing that the man I had trusted was plotting to claim my inheritance as his own. Now, I stood firmly grounded in purpose, direction, and accomplishment that extended far beyond merely protecting what was mine. Emily found me still at the window, her arms filled with inventory documents for the antique furniture being cataloged throughout the mansion. "You're looking contemplative," she observed, depositing the papers on a nearby desk. "Grandmother's expression," Harold calls it, that particular distant gaze that means you're seeing possibilities no one else has recognized yet. I smiled, acknowledging the comparison. I was just thinking about how much has changed. Not just the estate, but me. I gestured toward the grounds and the house around us. All of this activity, all this restoration and education and community engagement, it's so different from what Mark and Natalie envisioned. "You mean their plan? To gut the historical elements and create another soulless modern showplace?" Emily's tone held lingering disdain. "I still can't believe how close they came to destroying all of this." "That's not what I meant," I replied, turning from the window to face her. "I was thinking about how their actions, as hurtful and underhanded as they were, ultimately pushed me toward creating something more significant than I might have otherwise. If Mark hadn't betrayed me, if Natalie hadn't sent that email, would I have established the foundation? Would I have expanded into education and advocacy? Or would I have simply maintained the estate as a private residence, keeping its historical significance to myself?" Emily considered this, her expression thoughtful. "You've taken lemons and made, well, not just lemonade, but an entire orchard producing sustainable citrus for the community." I laughed at her metaphor. "Something like that. I've been thinking lately that I should thank them." Emily's eyebrows shot up in surprise. "Thank them? For trying to steal your inheritance?" "For pushing me toward my purpose," I clarified. "For forcing me to claim not just my inheritance, but my voice, my vision, my place in continuing grandmother's work." Before Emily could respond, Thomas Rodriguez appeared in the doorway, his expression suggesting he had overheard at least part of our conversation. "Speaking of Mark," he said with characteristic directness, "I thought you should know that he's taken a position with a development firm in Chicago. He's leaving Denver next month." I absorbed this information with mild surprise. Mark had been notably absent from Denver's real estate circles in recent months, his professional reputation damaged by the exposure of his attempted property schemes. Still, I hadn't expected him to leave the city entirely. "And Natalie?" asked, more out of curiosity than concern. Thomas shrugged. "Still in town, apparently. She's working for a small interior design firm in Cherry Creek, keeping a low profile since the Ridgewood situation became public knowledge." The Ridgewood situation, such a bland euphemism for what had been at the time the most painful betrayal of my life. Yet now, months later, I found I could think of Mark and Natalie with a detachment that bordered on indifference. They had receded into the background of my story, their roles diminished by the expanding scope of my own narrative. "Rebecca," called Harold from the main hall, "the Historical Commission representatives have arrived for the tour." Smoothing my blazer, a vintage piece from my grandmother's wardrobe that I had paired with contemporary trousers, I prepared to greet the commission members. Their support was crucial for the Henderson House restoration, and I wanted to demonstrate how effectively the foundation had managed the Ridgewood project. As I moved through the house, now humming with purpose and activity, I was struck by how completely it had transformed from the silent, empty mansion Mark and Natalie had coveted to a living center of education and preservation. Each room told a story, not just of the past, but of ongoing relevance and renewed significance. The tour proceeded smoothly, with the commission members expressing particular interest in the historical documentation techniques being employed by the student interns. As we concluded in the grand entrance hall, the commission chairwoman pulled me aside. "Ms. Wilson, the commission would like to recognize the Wilson Heritage Foundation at our annual awards ceremony next month. The work you're doing here, and now with the Henderson House, represents exactly the kind of thoughtful preservation our city needs." I accepted this honor with genuine pleasure, knowing how much it would have meant to my grandmother to see her preservation ethic not just maintained but amplified through the foundation's work. As the commission members departed, I found myself momentarily alone in the entrance hall, surrounded by the tangible results of months of careful restoration. The original parquet flooring gleamed with renewed luster, the hand-carved newel post on the grand staircase had been painstakingly repaired, the stained glass window above the door cast jewel-toned patterns across the marble floor. Everything that Mark and Natalie would have destroyed in their rush to modernize now stood as testimony to the value of preservation, the importance of honoring craftsmanship and historical significance rather than discarding them for contemporary trends. A text message from Grace interrupted my reflections. "Final divorce decree recorded today. Legal name change from Wilson to Montgomery now official." I had decided to take my grandmother's maiden name, a choice that represented not just the final severance from Mark, but a conscious connection to the legacy I was continuing. Rebecca Montgomery. The name felt right, aligned with my evolving identity and purpose. As afternoon stretched toward evening, I found myself drawn to the library, now restored to its original splendor with shelves fully stocked with my grandmother's collection of architectural and historical volumes. The hidden compartment behind the paneling remained accessible, though its contents, the journals and personal papers, had been carefully preserved and catalogued. I settled into the window seat, the same spot where my grandmother had often read to me as a child, and opened my laptop to review the prospectus for the Henderson House restoration. The fading autumn light slanted through the stained glass accents at the top of the windows, creating patterns across the polished wood floor that seemed to shift and evolve with the passing minutes, a visual metaphor for the way time changed perspective while core elements remained constant. A soft knock at the library door announced Emily's presence. She entered carrying 2 cups of tea, a welcome interruption to my work. "The contractor called about the Henderson House roof," she said, settling into the armchair opposite my window. "Seat. The slate tiles can be salvaged for the front facade, but the back section will need complete replacement. He wants to know if you want to match the original pattern or simply maintain the period-appropriate style." This was the kind of detail that might seem minor to outsiders, but represented a fundamental preservation philosophy. Did we aim for exact replication of original elements? Or was historical compatibility sufficient when exact matching wasn't practical? "Let's see what the Historical Commission recommends," I decided after a moment's consideration. If the original pattern has particular architectural significance, we should make the effort to recreate it. If it's more about general period aesthetics, compatibility might be sufficient. Emily nodded, making a note on her tablet. "That's what I thought you'd say. Always the balanced preservationist, not rigid about perfect replication, but not casual about historical accuracy either." "Grandmother's influence," I acknowledged with a smile. "She always said preservation wasn't about freezing a property in time, but about respecting its historical journey while ensuring its continued relevance." We sipped our tea in comfortable silence, watching as the autumn sunset painted the sky, in shades of amber and rose. In these quiet moments, I often felt my grandmother's presence most strongly, not as a ghost haunting the house, but as a continuing influence guiding my decisions and perspectives. "Oh, I almost forgot," Emily said suddenly, reaching into her pocket. "This came for you today. Hand-delivered." She passed me a cream-colored envelope, the paper heavy and expensive, my name written across the front in an elegant script I didn't immediately recognize. Inside was a simple card containing just a few handwritten lines. "Rebecca, I've accepted a position with a historical preservation firm in Boston. Before leaving Denver, I wanted to thank you for an unexpected lesson in integrity and purpose. What you've created with the Wilson, now Montgomery Heritage Foundation is truly remarkable. Natalie Palmer." I read the note twice, surprised not just by its existence but by the sincerity it conveyed. When I handed it to Emily, her eyebrows rose in astonishment. "Well, that's unexpected," she said after reading it. "Do you think she means it?" I considered the question, remembering Natalie as she had been in those early days, ambitious, calculating, willing to partner with Mark in his attempt to claim my inheritance. Yet there had been moments, even then, when I'd sensed she possessed a depth Mark lacked, an appreciation for the historical significance of the Ridgewood estate that went beyond its monetary value or status implications. "I think she does," I replied finally. "People can change, especially when they're forced to confront the consequences of their choices." "Are you going to respond?" Emily asked, returning the card to its envelope. I shook my head. "There's nothing more to say. We've both moved on to different paths." As evening settled over the estate, casting long shadows across the grounds and wrapping the house in twilight, I returned to the Henderson House prospectus, making notes on preservation priorities and potential educational opportunities, though new property would provide. The sound of cars arriving drew me to the window. The monthly meeting of the Denver Historical Architecture Society was scheduled to be held in the Ridgewood Estate's renovated carriage house, now converted into a community meeting space that maintained its historical exterior while providing modern facilities inside. Another example of the balanced preservation approach my grandmother had championed. Watching as society members made their way along the illuminated garden path toward the carriage house, I felt a sense of rightness, of purpose fulfilled. The Ridgewood estate had returned to its intended function as not just a residence, but a center for community engagement and education. My phone rang, a number I didn't immediately recognize. When I answered, the voice on the other end was hesitant, almost cautious. "Rebecca, it's Mark." I hadn't spoken directly to Mark in months, our communication limited to legal exchanges through attorneys. Hearing his voice stirred no emotional response beyond mild curiosity about the purpose of his call. "Thomas told me you're moving to Chicago," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "Yes, next month." A pause, laden with unspoken history. "I wanted to before I left Denver. That is." "What is it, Mark?" I prompted, my patience for his characteristic indirectness considerably diminished. He sighed, a sound that carried a complex mixture of resignation and reluctant admiration. "I wanted to tell you that I was wrong about the Ridgewood estate, about your vision for it. I saw the article in Denver Architecture Monthly about the foundation's work. What you've created there, it's remarkable." Coming so soon after Natalie's note, this unexpected acknowledgement suggested the two might have discussed their respective reckonings before Mark's departure from Denver. "Thank you," I replied simply, neither dismissing his admission nor placing particular value on it. "I don't expect forgiveness," he continued, his voice steadier now. "But I wanted you to know that I understand now what I tried to take from you, not just property, but purpose, legacy." I watched as more cars arrived for the Historical Society meeting, thinking about how different my life had become since that early morning email from Natalie. How completely my focus had shifted from protecting what was mine to creating something meaningful for others. We all have our own paths, Mark, I said finally. I'm on mine now. I hope you find yours in Chicago. After we ended the call, I stood for a moment at the library window, reflecting on the journey that had brought me to this point. From the shock and betrayal of discovering Mark and Natalie's scheme to the creation of the Montgomery Heritage Foundation and the expanding scope of its preservation work, each step had been part of a transformation more profound than I could have imagined in those first painful days. Emily reappeared at the library door. The Historical Society members are asking if you'll say a few words before their meeting begins. Something about the restoration philosophy guiding the Foundation's work. I nodded, gathering my thoughts as I prepared to address the group. The Foundation's philosophy was ultimately my grandmother's, refined through my own experience and perspective. That preservation wasn't about preventing change, but about ensuring that change respected and incorporated the valuable elements of the past. As I made my way through the house, now alive with purpose and activity, I thought about the hidden strengths that challenges reveal, not just in historic structures that endure through generations, but in the people who recognize their value and fight to protect them. The carriage house buzzed with conversation as society members discussed upcoming preservation initiatives, architectural trends, and community engagement strategies. When I entered, the room quieted, all eyes turning expectantly toward me. Standing before them, I felt the weight of my grandmother's legacy and the momentum of my own expanding vision. The betrayal that had once seemed like an ending had instead become a beginning, the catalyst for a purpose that extended far beyond personal property to embrace community heritage and educational opportunity. Thank you all for coming this evening, I began, surveying the assembled preservation enthusiasts. My grandmother often said that historical properties aren't just buildings, they're repositories of stories, craftsmanship, and community identity. Our work isn't about freezing these properties in time, but about ensuring their stories continue to be told, their craftsmanship continues to be appreciated, and their place in our community's identity remains secure. As I spoke about the Foundation's approach to balanced preservation, I recognized how completely my personal narrative had transformed. From a woman fighting to protect her inheritance, to a leader advancing a vision that extended far beyond individual ownership. Mark and Natalie had thought they were writing a simple story of acquisition and modernization, never understanding the deeper significance of what they sought to claim. Their betrayal had forced me to articulate and defend that significance. First, to protect my inheritance, then to honor my grandmother's legacy, and finally to advance a preservation ethic that benefited the broader community. Later that evening, after the society meeting concluded and the last cars departed down the long driveway, I returned to the main house. The restored rooms were quiet now, the day's activities concluded, the various teams and visitors gone until tomorrow. In the stillness, I could almost feel the house breathing around me, not with the emptiness that had characterized it when I first reclaimed it from Mark and Natalie's schemes, but with the satisfied fullness of a space fulfilling its purpose, a structure whose significance was recognized and honored. My grandmother's portrait still hung above the library fireplace, her expression combining wisdom and determination in equal measure. Standing before it, I felt a sense of completion, of promises kept, and legacy secured. "We did it, grandmother," I said softly to the painted image. "We protected what matters." But even as I acknowledged this achievement, I knew it wasn't an endpoint but a milestone on a continuing journey. Tomorrow would bring new challenges with the Henderson House restoration, new opportunities for education and advocacy, new ways to extend the Foundation's impact on Denver's historical preservation landscape. Mark and Natalie had unwittingly pushed me toward this expanded purpose when they tried to claim what wasn't theirs to take. Their betrayal had forced me to defend not just my ownership, but my vision, to articulate not just what the Ridgewood estate was, but what it could become. As autumn deepened toward winter, the Ridgewood estate stood as a testament to the power of preservation, the importance of legacy, and the unexpected ways that challenges can reveal strengths previously undiscovered. Its graceful lines and historical features, now restored and maintained with careful attention, would continue to tell their story to future generations, a story enriched rather than erased by the passing of time. And my own story continued to evolve alongside it, no longer defined by what I had prevented Mark and Natalie from taking, but by what I was creating in the space their betrayal had unexpectedly opened. The following morning dawned clear and cold, the grounds of the Ridgewood estate glittering with the first frost of the season. I woke early, drawn to the window by the particular quality of winter light that made the historic buildings seem to glow from within, their solid structures defying the transient nature of the frost that decorated their surfaces. Today marked an important milestone for the foundation, the signing of the final documents for the Henderson House acquisition and the public announcement of its planned restoration. The press would arrive at 10, followed by representatives from Denver's preservation community and neighborhood advocates who had fought against the property's proposed demolition. As I dressed for the day's events, selecting a structured blazer in my grandmother's favorite shade of burgundy, I reviewed the journey that had brought me, and the foundation, to this moment of expansion and increased influence. The betrayal that had once seemed devastating had ultimately revealed strengths I might never have discovered otherwise. My capacity for strategic thinking, my ability to articulate and defend a preservation philosophy, my skill in building the alliances necessary to transform a personal mission into a community resource. Downstairs, the estate hummed with preparation for the day's announcement. Emily coordinated with the caterers setting up in the formal dining room, while Harold arranged architectural renderings of the Henderson House restoration plans on easels in the grand entrance hall. "The mayor just confirmed she'll be attending," Grace announced, entering with her ever-present portfolio and characteristic efficiency. "And the Historical Commission chairman wants 5 minutes to speak about the significance of saving another Gilded Age property from demolition." I nodded, making a mental note to adjust the event timeline. The mayor's presence elevated the announcement from a private foundation initiative to a civic priority, exactly the kind of institutional support we needed to expand our preservation. Efforts beyond individual properties to comprehensive neighborhood conservation. As I moved through the house, checking final arrangements and reviewing talking points, I was struck by how completely the Ridgewood estate had transformed from a silent, elegant museum piece to a vibrant center of activity and purpose. Every room now served a function beyond mere preservation. The former ballroom hosted educational workshops, the morning room had become a research center, the conservatory housed exhibits on historical landscaping techniques. This transformation represented the fulfillment of my grandmother's vision, not just maintaining historical properties, but ensuring their continued relevance and utility in contemporary society. A text message from Thomas Rodriguez provided the day's first surprise. Mark called to wish the foundation success with the Henderson House. Said to tell you he's recommended several Chicago clients consider preservation rather than demolition for their historical properties. I smiled slightly at this unexpected development. Perhaps Mark's exposure to the foundation's work had sparked genuine appreciation for preservation, or perhaps he was simply attempting to rehabilitate his professional reputation after the Ridgewood debacle. Either way, if historical properties benefited from his newfound advocacy, the outcome was positive regardless of motivation. The morning proceeded smoothly, with press arriving precisely at 10 and the formal announcement scheduled for 11. As I greeted preservation advocates and community leaders in the grand entrance hall, now restored to its original splendor with period-appropriate furnishings and meticulously repaired architectural details, I was conscious of how different this moment was from the confrontation with Mark and Natalie that had occurred in this same space months earlier. Then, I had been defending my right to maintain my inheritance against those who would have claimed and transformed it. Now, I was expanding that inheritance into a growing foundation with influence extending throughout Denver's preservation community. "Ms. Montgomery," called a voice I didn't immediately recognize. Turning, I found myself face to face with Caroline Walsh, the real estate agent who had worked with Mark and Natalie on their fraudulent attempt to purchase the Ridgewood estate. Her expression conveyed professional composure overlaid with evident discomfort at our unexpected encounter. "I wanted to congratulate you on the Henderson House acquisition. It's a significant achievement for historical preservation in Denver." I acknowledged her congratulations with a polite nod, curious about her presence at the event, but maintaining the diplomatic poise required of a foundation director at a public function. "My firm has shifted focus," she continued, apparently sensing my unspoken question. "We're now specializing in historically significant properties with preservation potential rather than development opportunities. Your foundation's work actually influenced that decision." This revelation, that our preservation efforts had impacted business practices within Denver's real estate community, represented an influence far beyond what I had initially envisioned when establishing the foundation. "I'm glad to hear it," I replied sincerely. "There's certainly growing market appreciation for thoughtfully preserved properties." As Caroline moved on to greet other attendees, I found myself reflecting on the ripple effects of choices made and actions taken, how my decision to fight for my inheritance had expanded beyond personal vindication to professional impact and community benefit. The formal announcement proceeded as planned, with the mayor emphasizing the civic importance of architectural preservation and the historical commission chairman detailing the Henderson House's significant features. When my turn came to speak, I stepped to the podium with a clear sense of purpose and direction. The Montgomery Heritage Foundation began with a single property and a personal commitment to honoring my grandmother's preservation legacy, I told the assembled guests and media representatives. With the acquisition of the Henderson House, we expand that commitment to encompass a broader vision, the creation of a preservation corridor linking historically significant properties throughout Central Denver. This announcement, the first public mention of the Foundation's long-term strategic plan, generated exactly the buzz of excitement and interest I had anticipated. The preservation corridor concept represented a shift from individual property, focused to neighborhood-scale conservation, with potential to influence Denver's development patterns for generations to come. As questions followed from media and preservation advocates, I outlined the Foundation's expanded mission with growing confidence. Each inquiry provided an opportunity to articulate a vision that had evolved from simply protecting the Ridgewood estate to creating a comprehensive approach to urban historical conservation. Following the formal announcement, as guests mingled and explored the restoration work that had transformed the Ridgewood estate, I found a moment of quiet in my grandmother's library. The room remained my favorite retreat, its walls of books, and carefully preserved original features providing both inspiration and grounding. Grace joined me there, her expression suggesting she had news to share. "I've just had an interesting conversation with the mayor's chief of staff," she said, settling into one of the leather armchairs. "They're considering creating a formal Historical Properties Advisory Board with statutory authority to review development proposals affecting designated historical structures. They want you to chair it." This invitation represented institutional recognition of the expertise I had developed, first through necessity when defending my inheritance, then through dedicated study and practical application in the Foundation's work. That would significantly expand our influence, I acknowledged, considering the strategic implications. From private advocacy to public policy. Grace nodded, understanding as always the layered significance of this opportunity. "It's quite a journey from fighting Mark's attempt to steal your inheritance to shaping citywide preservation policy." The observation struck me as profoundly true. What had begun as a personal battle to protect my grandmother's legacy had evolved into something with far broader implications and impact. The betrayal that had once seemed so devastating had ultimately opened a path to purpose I might never have discovered otherwise. As the day's events concluded and the last guest departed, I found myself once more in the grand entrance hall, now quiet in the gathering dusk. The Henderson House acquisition documents lay signed on the antique sideboard, their legal language confirming the expansion of the Foundation's preservation work. Emily appeared beside me, her expression thoughtful as she surveyed the now empty hall. "Do you ever think about how differently things might have turned out?" she asked. "If Mark and Natalie had succeeded in taking the Ridgewood estate." I considered her question, trying to imagine an alternate version of events where I had failed to protect my inheritance, where the carefully preserved historical features around us had been destroyed to create a contemporary showcase, where my grandmother's legacy had been erased rather than amplified. "I think about how differently I might have turned out," I replied after a moment. "If I hadn't been forced to fight for this place, I might never have discovered what I was capable of creating. What began as defense became foundation, in multiple senses of the word." Emily nodded, understanding the wordplay and its deeper significance. From victim to visionary, from protecting the past to shaping the future. As night settled over the Ridgewood estate, its restored features illuminated by carefully placed lighting that highlighted their historical significance while ensuring their contemporary relevance, I felt a sense of alignment between past, present, and future, between my grandmother's legacy, my current purpose, and the extended impact of the Foundation's expanding work. Mark and Natalie had thought they were writing a simple story of acquisition and modernization when they attempted to claim my inheritance. They hadn't understood that they were merely catalysts in a much more significant narrative, one about the enduring value of preservation, the expanding definition of legacy, and the unexpected ways that betrayal can sometimes lead to blessing. The Ridgewood estate stood solid and enduring in the gathering darkness, its structures strengthened through careful restoration, its significance enhanced through educational programming, its future secured through the Foundation's expanding influence. Like me, it had emerged from attempts to fundamentally alter its nature, not just intact, but strengthened, its essential character preserved while its purpose and impact continued to evolve. And as I moved through the quiet rooms, switching off lights and checking locks before retiring for the evening, I felt not just the satisfaction of promises kept and legacy honored, but the anticipation of possibilities still unfolding, a future built on foundations both physical and philosophical, both inherited and created, both personal and communal. The path that had begun with defending what was rightfully mine now extended toward sharing its significance with an ever-widening circle of beneficiaries. The battle that had started with exposing Mark and Natalie's deception now continued as advocacy for transparent and respectful approaches to historical properties throughout the city. In the end, what they had tried to take from me had become something greater than even I had initially imagined. Not just a house or an inheritance, but a purpose, a platform, and a perpetuating legacy that would continue to influence Denver's architectural landscape long after the betrayal that had catalyzed its creation had faded from memory. 5 years after that fateful morning when I received Natalie's email, I stood on the observation deck of Denver's newest architectural landmark, the Montgomery Preservation Center. The gleaming glass structure rose alongside the carefully restored facade of what had once been the Wellington Industrial Works, creating a striking visual dialogue between historical preservation and contemporary design. Below me, guests gathered for the center's grand opening celebration, their excited voices drifting upward as they explored the interactive exhibits showcasing Denver's architectural heritage and the Foundation's preservation methodology. What had begun as a personal battle to protect my grandmother's legacy had evolved into a nationally recognized approach to urban conservation, now housed in a dedicated facility that would serve as both headquarters and educational resource. "Quite a view," said a familiar voice behind me. I turned to find Harold Montgomery, now the Foundation's chairman emeritus, his eyes bright with emotion as he surveyed the culmination of our shared vision. At 82, he had officially retired last year, though he still attended every board meeting and regularly consulted on preservation criteria. My grandmother would have loved this, I replied, gesturing toward the expansive space below where historical artifacts, interactive technology, and architectural exhibits combined to tell the story of Denver's built environment. Especially the apprenticeship program. The apprenticeship initiative had become one of the Foundation's most successful endeavors, training young craftspeople in traditional building techniques to ensure that restoration skills would continue into future generations. Many of the program's graduates now worked on preservation projects throughout the country, spreading both technical expertise and conservation values. Adelaide was always focused on the future, even when preserving the past, Harold agreed, leaning slightly on his cane as he moved to stand beside me at the railing. But I don't think even she could have imagined this. Below us, the exhibition hall bustled with activity as final preparations were made for the formal opening ceremony. The mayor would speak first, followed by the governor and representatives from the National Preservation Council, which had officially adopted the Montgomery methodology as their recommended approach for integrated urban preservation. The Chicago delegation has arrived, announced Emily, appearing with her tablet displaying the guest list for the evening's gala, including Mark and his team. I nodded, unsurprised by this information. Our collaborative exhibition on Denver-Chicago architectural connections had evolved into an ongoing professional partnership between our respective foundations, with regular knowledge exchange and joint advocacy for preservation policy at the federal level. Have them shown to the founders' room, I instructed. I'll greet them before the ceremony begins. As Emily departed to handle this diplomatic task, Harold gave me a questioning look. You're comfortable with Mark being here today? This is your triumph, after all. I considered the question, reflecting on the complex evolution of relationships that had characterized the past 5 years. Mark and I maintained a strictly professional connection, our communication limited to preservation matters, and conducted primarily through respective foundation staff. The personal betrayal that had once seemed so devastating had receded into background context, relevant to the Foundation's origin story, but no longer emotionally significant. It's appropriate, I replied after a moment. His foundation has contributed to advancing preservation awareness in Chicago, just as we've done in Denver. The methodology being celebrated today is stronger for having been implemented in multiple urban contexts. Harold nodded, understanding as always the distinction between personal history and professional mission. And Natalie? I saw her name on the academic panel for tomorrow's symposium. Her course on ethical adaptation of historical properties has apparently become quite influential in design education, I acknowledged. The symposium committee recommended her inclusion based on merit, and I saw no reason to object. The irony wasn't lost on me, that the woman who had once partnered with Mark in an attempt to strip the Ridgewood estate of its historical features was now teaching future designers about respectful approaches to architectural heritage. People evolved, sometimes in unexpected directions, their values and priorities shifting through experience and education. A gentle chime sounded, indicating 30 minutes until the opening ceremony. Harold excused himself to greet arriving dignitaries, while I remained briefly alone on the observation deck, taking a final quiet moment before immersing myself in the public celebrations. From this height, I could see portions of what we now called the Heritage Corridor, the connected series of preserved historical properties stretching from the Ridgewood estate through the Henderson House and 5 additional restored landmarks, creating a walkable route showcasing Denver's architectural evolution. Each property now served dual purposes: historical showcase and community resource, embodying the Foundation's core philosophy that preservation required not just protection, but renewed relevance. The journey that had brought me to this moment seemed both improbable and inevitable, a path that had begun with defending my inheritance and evolved into creating a comprehensive approach to urban conservation with national influence. The betrayal that had initially driven me had long since transformed into purpose that stood independent of its catalyst. Making my way downstairs to the founder's room, I prepared to greet the Chicago delegation with professional courtesy. Mark's foundation had indeed accomplished significant preservation work in its home city, saving several threatened landmarks and establishing educational programs similar to our own. Our collaboration remained focused on the shared mission rather than our personal history, a relationship defined by mutual respect for preservation goals rather than any attempt at reconciliation. The Founder's Room, designed to host distinguished visitors and special foundation events, showcased artifacts from my grandmother's original property portfolio, alongside interactive displays detailing the development of the Montgomery methodology. As I entered, I found Mark standing before a photograph of the Ridgewood estate, examining the image with an expression I couldn't quite interpret. "Rebecca," he acknowledged, turning as I approached. His appearance had changed somewhat over the years, silver now threading through his dark hair, lines at the corners of his eyes suggesting both age and experience. "The center is remarkable. Congratulations." "Thank you," I replied, accepting the professional compliment in the spirit it was offered. "Your foundation's implementation of the methodology in Chicago provided valuable comparative data for the national model." He nodded, understanding the parameters of our interaction. Collegial but limited, defined by shared professional interests rather than our former connection. "I've been thinking about that morning," he said suddenly, his tone shifting toward the personal in a way that surprised me. "When you confronted Natalie and me at the Historical Commission meeting, I didn't understand then what you were fighting. For not really. I saw only property value, not historical significance or legacy." This unexpected reference to our past conflict momentarily disrupted our carefully maintained professional distance. I studied his expression, finding what appeared to be genuine reflection rather than any attempt at manipulation. "What we value reveals who we are," I responded after a moment, neither accepting an apology nor offering absolution. "My priorities were shaped by my grandmother's influence. Yours have evidently evolved through different experiences." He accepted this assessment with a slight nod, returning to the safer territory of professional discussion. "The Chicago Foundation is looking at expanding into Milwaukee next year. Their industrial architecture is significantly at risk. The Milwaukee Preservation Alliance would be natural partners," I suggested, seamlessly transitioning back to our established interaction parameters. "They've already documented most of the threatened properties in their manufacturing district." As we continued discussing preservation strategies, I was conscious of how completely our relationship had transformed, from personal to professional, from intimate to collegial, from betrayal to parallel purpose. The pain that had once seemed unbearable had faded into historical context, relevant to understanding how we had arrived at our current positions, but no longer emotionally significant. A staff member appeared at the doorway, indicating that the opening ceremony would begin in 10 minutes. As we moved to join the other participants, Mark paused briefly. "For what it's worth," he said, his voice lowered to ensure privacy. "The work you've done here, not just with the foundation but with the methodology development, it's changed how many of us approach preservation, including me." I acknowledged this statement with a simple nod, neither seeking nor requiring his validation but accepting the professional respect it represented. The Montgomery methodology's influence spoke for itself through implementation in cities nationwide, each adaptation strengthening its core principles while demonstrating their flexibility across different urban contexts. The grand exhibition hall had reached capacity as we entered, with preservation advocates, community leaders, architectural professionals, and education partners gathered to celebrate the center's opening. The space itself embodied our integrated approach. the restored industrial structure providing historical authenticity, while contemporary additions created functional areas for research, education, and community engagement. Taking my place on the stage alongside civic leaders and preservation representatives, I surveyed the gathered crowd with a sense of accomplishment tempered by awareness of ongoing challenges. Despite the Foundation's successes, historical properties throughout Denver and beyond remained threatened by development pressure, neglect, and policy limitations. The Preservation Center represented not a culmination, but a strengthened foundation for continuing work. The mayor spoke first, highlighting the economic benefits of heritage tourism generated by the Foundation's preservation corridor. The governor followed, announcing a state-level adoption of preservation guidelines based on the Montgomery methodology. Representatives from the National Preservation Council detailed how our approach was being implemented in cities throughout the country, creating a coordinated network of urban conservation initiatives. When my turn came to address the gathering, I stepped forward with the quiet confidence that had developed throughout years of advocacy, education, and strategic implementation. 5 years ago, the Montgomery Heritage Foundation began with a single property and a simple mission: to demonstrate that historical preservation could serve not just architectural conservation, but community revitalization, educational advancement, and cultural continuity. The crowd listened attentively as I continued, many nodding in recognition of the Foundation's evolution from local initiative to national model. Today, the Preservation Center represents the next phase in that mission, creating a permanent home for research, education, and advocacy that will ensure our methodology continues to develop and adapt to emerging preservation challenges. I gestured toward the interactive exhibits surrounding us, each showcasing different aspects of the integrated preservation approach. What we celebrate today isn't just a building or a methodology, but a fundamental shift in how we value our architectural heritage, not as obstacles to progress, but as foundations for sustainable community identity, economic vitality, and cultural continuity. As applause followed my remarks, I felt a momentary connection to my grandmother, a sense that she would have approved not just of the properties preserved, but of the expanded purpose they now served. She had built a property portfolio as a woman in a male-dominated field. I had transformed that inheritance into a foundation reshaping national preservation practice. Different expressions of the same determined spirit, separated by generations, but aligned in fundamental values. The formal ceremony transitioned into an evening reception, with guests exploring the center's exhibits, while Foundation staff provided guided tours, highlighting specific preservation techniques and educational programs. I circulated among the attendees, accepting congratulations and discussing future initiatives with supporters, partners, and potential collaborators. Natalie Palmer made a brief appearance, maintaining professional courtesy while avoiding any reference to our complicated history. Her design students demonstrated clear enthusiasm for the center's interactive exhibits, particularly the virtual reality reconstructions of historical buildings that had been lost to demolition. Technology that made visible what preservation sought to prevent. "Your grandmother would be immensely proud," Grace observed, joining me for a moment of relative quiet near the central exhibit detailing the Foundation's evolution. Now the Foundation's chief legal counsel, she had been instrumental in creating the policy frameworks that protected not just individual properties, but entire historical districts throughout Denver. "She gave me the starting point," I acknowledged, glancing toward a photograph of Adelaide Montgomery standing before the Ridgewood estate in its earlier days. "But I think she would be most pleased by how far beyond that beginning we've come, how her preservation ethic has expanded into a comprehensive methodology with national impact." As the evening proceeded, I found myself increasingly reflective, considering the journey from defending my inheritance to creating a legacy that extended far beyond physical properties. The betrayal that had catalyzed that journey had long since lost its emotional charge, transformed into merely the opening chapter of a much more significant narrative. Later, as the reception concluded and guests departed, I made my way back to the observation deck, seeking a moment of solitude to process the day's significance. The heritage corridor stretched below me, each preserved property illuminated to highlight its architectural features, creating a visual pathway through Denver's historical development. Emily joined me there, bringing 2 glasses of champagne, for a private toast away from the public celebrations. "To your grandmother," she suggested, raising her glass, "who left you more than just properties." "And to unexpected beginnings," I added, thinking of how completely my life had transformed since that early morning email from Natalie. Even when they arrived disguised as devastating endings. Emily nodded, understanding the reference to those difficult early days when Mark and Natalie's betrayal had seemed overwhelming, rather than merely catalytic. "Do you ever wonder how differently things might have turned out?" she asked. "If Mark and Natalie hadn't tried to take the Ridgewood estate, would you have established the foundation, developed the methodology, created all of this?" I considered her question seriously, looking out over the illuminated city where the foundation's influence was now visible in dozens of preserved properties, educational programs, and policy frameworks. "I might eventually have found my way to something similar," I replied after a moment. Grandmother's influence was always guiding me toward preservation values, but the urgency, the clarity of purpose, the determination to create something that couldn't be taken away, those came from having to fight for what was already mine. We stood in comfortable silence, watching as the last visitors departed from the center below, the staff beginning the process of preparing for tomorrow's academic symposium and public tours. "The Chicago Foundation has invited us to consult on their Milwaukee expansion," Emily mentioned eventually. "Are you comfortable with that level of ongoing collaboration with Mark?" I smiled slightly at her persistent concern about my emotional well-being regarding my ex-husband, appreciating her loyalty while finding it increasingly unnecessary. "The professional relationship works," I replied simply. "His foundation does. Good preservation work. Our past is relevant to how we arrived at our current positions, but not to the work itself." As Emily departed to assist with final closing procedures, I remained briefly alone on the observation deck, reflecting on the journey that had brought me to this moment of professional accomplishment and personal peace. The Ridgewood estate that Mark and Natalie had coveted was now just one component of a comprehensive preservation initiative with national influence, still my home, still the Foundation's headquarters, but no longer the sole focus of my purpose or identity. The betrayal that had once seemed devastating had ultimately revealed strengths I might otherwise never have discovered. My capacity for strategic thinking, my ability to articulate and implement a preservation philosophy, my skill in building the alliances necessary to transform personal mission into community benefit and national methodology. Mark and Natalie had thought they were writing a simple story of acquisition and renovation when they attempted to claim my inheritance. They hadn't understood they were merely catalysts in a much more significant narrative, one about the enduring value of preservation, the expanding definition of legacy, and the unexpected ways that challenges can reveal purposes previously undiscovered. As I prepared to leave the Preservation Center on its opening night, I carried with me the satisfaction of promises kept and vision expanded. My grandmother's legacy honored and extended into areas she might never have imagined, but would certainly have approved. The Montgomery methodology would continue to evolve, adapting to new preservation challenges while maintaining its core principles of integrated conservation, education, and community engagement. The Foundation's influence would expand to additional cities, each implementation strengthening the approach while demonstrating its flexibility across different urban contexts. And I would continue guiding this evolution, my path forward defined not by the betrayal that had initiated the journey, but by the purpose discovered along the way. Not by what I had prevented Mark and Natalie from taking, but by what I had created in the space their actions had unexpectedly opened. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.